When thinking about maintenance and modifications, we often think about what's necessary to keep our car going, but we cannot forget about what's required to stop. Which is why today, we'll be replacing two main components in our braking system, the brake pads and rotors. This time, I'll be using the Hawk High Performance Street 5.0 brake pads paired with the OEM Brembo drilled rotors. Starting with the back wheels, let's crack the lug nuts loose and raise up the car. Then simply finish removing the lug nuts and take off the wheels. Also, we'll need to be sure that the parking brake is down while changing the rear brakes. There will be two pins to punch out on each side of the rear calipers. You can either use a punch tool or a really thin screwdriver paired with a hammer to punch them out. Depending on which year STI you have, there may be a couple retaining clips to remove on the back of the pins, but my 2018 STI does not. A pair of needle nose pliers may also come in handy to finish removing the pins. The bracket of the brake pads will also come off once the pins are removed. Now we just have to remove the brake pads. If your brake pads won't come out, sticking a screwdriver into one of the holes and prying it will help push in the pistons of the calipers, allowing the pads to slide right out. My rear brake pads have nearly 100,000 miles on them, with mostly highway miles, and clearly have never been changed. But by measuring the brake pads and subtracting the backing plate, we can see that there is still about 4.8 millimeters of pad left, so there is still a couple of millimeters or so before the wear indicators would begin to squeak, but it's still a good time to change them. Since we're also changing out the rotors, we'll need to remove two 17mm bolts that connect the calipers to the knuckle. Hanging the calipers to the suspension with a bungee cord is a good way to prevent the calipers from dangling by the brake lines. More than likely, your rotors won't be able to come straight off, and while using a mallet is a common way of helping to free up the rotors, these rotors have two holes specifically made for this purpose. Simply screw in a couple M8 by 1.25 bolts all the way until you hear the rotor break loose. Then remove the screws and pull off the rotor. On the rear rotors, there will be a dust boot that we'll need to transfer over from the old rotor to the new one. With the rotor off, we can clean up the area by using some brake cleaner. It may also be a good idea to wear a pair of goggles to prevent the brake cleaner from getting into your eyes. Then, use a metal wire brush to clean around the hub. We can also spray some brake clean on the new rotors to help get rid of that protective oily factory coating. With everything cleaned up, it's time to begin the install of our fresh new rotors. Simply line up the hose of the rotor with the wheel studs and slide it into place. Temporarily screwing in a lug nut will also help keep the rotor in place while reinstalling the calipers. Now we can reinstall the caliper onto the knuckle with the two 17mm bolts we removed earlier. It's up to you if you want to add some anti-seize to the threads, as many people in the Subi community highly recommend it, since the threads are known for stripping out of the calipers, resulting in needing a helicoil, which we don't want, so it's better to be safe than sorry. Let's torque these bolts down to 47 foot-pounds. It's finally time to prepare our new brake pads. Before we install them, let's apply some of the included grease to the back shims, being careful not to get any on the pad itself. Since the new pads have more material than the old ones, they probably won't slide in without compressing the caliper pistons. So I recommend using some sort of pad spreader like this one to make it a lot easier. It's very important that the pad material side faces the rotor to be able to work. After the brake pads are installed, we need to reinstall the bracket. The pins will slide through the holes of the caliper and brake pads while going over the bracket. Carefully hammer in the pins, making sure they are going in correctly. Then remove the lug nut we temporarily used to keep the rotor in place. And before we seal the deal on this wheel, I heard you loud and clear, and will be taking this opportunity to upgrade my lug nuts with the black Subaru OEM lug nut and lock set. Not to be confused with the acorn-shaped OEM aluminum ones. These are super underrated. They're Subaru branded McGuards, and it even comes with a little pouch for the lug lock key. They're pretty much better in every way. The only problem I could find with this is that it adds extra weight to my car. Now let's get back to finishing up the other side of the rear rotor and brake pads. With the rear rotor and brake pads complete, it's time to get the wheels back on the car and prepare to do the front. The process for removing the front calipers are pretty much the same, with there still being 2 pins to punch out, but this time there's a 13mm bolt in the middle to remove from the back. The middle bolt is connected to the pin like this. Then remove the retaining clips on the end of the pins, if you have them, and punch them out. Now we need to remove the brake pads, and just like before, we can stick a flathead through the hole of the pad and pry it so the caliper pistons will compress a bit in order to slide them out. There will also be a shim on the back of these pads that we'll reuse on the back of the new pads. As you can see, there is a lot more pad material left on the front pads, and that's because the previous owner replaced the front pads and rotors a little over 50,000 miles ago, so they probably still have plenty of miles left on them, but for peace of mind, I'll change them anyway. To remove the caliper from the knuckle, there will be 2 19mm bolts to remove, and you probably will need a deep socket in order to clear this bolt protruding out near the top bolt. Let's use our bungee cord to hang up the caliper. and use our M8 by 1.25 bolts to remove the rotor. Then just clean up our area like before. Attach and clean off our new rotor. Use some anti-sieze on the two 19mm bolts if you choose. Then reattach the caliper to the knuckle. There is a lot of confusion for the torque specs here because some of the official Subaru manuals say 114 foot-pounds, but that's just way too much, so we can safely assume that they meant 114.3 nanometers, which is roughly 80 foot-pounds. Then attach the shim from the old pad to the back of the new one if you haven't done so already, and apply the provided grease. Since the front calipers are 6 pistons, a pad spreader is highly recommended here since all pistons need to be compressed at the same time for it to work, otherwise you'll be playing an endless game of whack-a-mole. Once the pistons are compressed enough, we'll be able to slide in our new brake pads. Just like before, the pins will go through the holes of the caliper and brake pads while going around the caliper bracket. Now just screw in the middle 13mm bolt on the caliper, which goes underneath the bracket. All we have to do now is repeat this process one last time on the other side, and we'll have our new brake pads and rotors successfully installed. Now let's finish buttoning everything back up with our new lug nuts acting as the cherry on top. We now have new brake pads, new rotors, and new lug nuts. But before we even think about driving, we literally need to pump the brakes to reset the caliper pistons we compressed earlier. The pedal will probably go straight to the floor the first time until enough pressure builds up in the caliper pistons. Then the brake pressure will return. You can now go out and bed your brakes, but for now, let's go in and take a well-deserved break ourselves by checking out a couple more styling videos and consider subscribing for more automotive content.